Welcome to my channel. Today we travel to Baghdad. No, not the chaotic, war-torn city of today, but its glorious version from 833 to 994 AD, also called the Islamic Golden Age. We will meet some of the brightest minds of their time and see how they changed the world at the House of Wisdom, aka Dar al-Hikmah. But more on that later. Let's dive right in. You may have heard of the Library of Alexandria or the Great Fire of Rome, but few stories are as dramatic as the destruction of the House of Wisdom. A place where hundreds of thousands of books were lost forever, killing the flame of progress and sending humanity back into the Dark Ages. Or is this story not what it seems? It all started when Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid decided to build a palace library. But instead of restricting access to only himself, he allowed scholars to freely enter, borrow books and even return with their own texts. What started as a modest collection soon grew into one of the largest libraries of its day. It was called the House of Wisdom because of the many wise people gathering there. Scholars came from all over the known world, crossing the Mediterranean, sailing from India and traveling across Persia, all to make the pilgrimage to Baghdad and its House of Wisdom. Here, the works of Aristotle, Plato and other Greek philosophers met those of Indian and Persian scientists and Mesopotamian mathematicians, creating the most diverse assembly of knowledge anywhere on Earth. There were numerous courtyards within the palace complex, each housing a library with different collections. The main hall contained a magnificent octagonal dome, surrounded by 8 archways, each representing a different field of study: astronomy, physics, mathematics, alchemy, medicine, zoology, botany, and grammar. At the center stood a fountain and a statue of Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom. Next to it, a minting press produced special coins minted only for the House of Wisdom. These coins were stamped with the phrase "conquerors of the Greeks," celebrating how Muslim scholars were seen as the heirs of ancient Greek knowledge. We can now meet our first scholar. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. He had arrived from Central Asia and quickly made a name for himself as the master of calculation. Khwarizmi translated many Indian mathematical texts, introducing Hindu-Arabic numerals to the West. And that's the system we use today. In his spare time, he invented algorithms, developed new methods to calculate areas and volumes, and created the foundation for algebra. Yes, that's why we call solving equations algebra today. He basically wrote the book on it. But Khwarizmi wasn't the only star at the House of Wisdom. There was also Yahya ibn al-Sayyid al-Kindi, who excelled in geometry and wrote on spherical trigonometry. Trying to explain how shapes look on spheres. This was groundbreaking for astronomy and helped describe planetary motion. You probably recognize his name because in the West he is known as the philosopher of Arabia. Al-Kindi was highly respected and could often be found discussing philosophy and theology with fellow scholars, debating the existence of God and the nature of reality. So even though he was a mathematician, they called him Al-Hikmah, meaning the wise one. There was also Ibn al-Nafis, who lived in the 13th century and is considered the father of both anatomy and pediatrics. He published a book describing the circulatory system and realized that blood is pumped by the heart and flows through the arteries. Wow! And last but certainly not least, there was Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi, famous for his surgical innovations, and his 5-book Encyclopedia of Surgery, which remained standard practice for 500 years. He performed more than 100 different surgical procedures and invented dozens of instruments we still use today, like retractors, forceps, and scalpels. I could mention so many more scholars, but you get the picture. The House of Wisdom attracted the brightest minds from all over the world. These men worked, ate, slept, argued, and socialized here. They shared meals, smoked tobacco, played chess, and exchanged ideas. It was almost like a university campus, except it was much more international and interdisciplinary. Not only did they preserve ancient texts, they also translated them into Arabic. To spread knowledge, they published their findings in manuscripts and sent them to other libraries around the world. Their work influenced countless thinkers, from the Italian scientist Galileo to English physicist Isaac Newton. The House of Wisdom didn't just collect books, it pioneered several little-known innovations. For example, scholars here were the first to develop the scientific method, starting with a hypothesis and then testing it with experiments. They introduced peer review, where experts check each other's work before publication, and they even created the first astronomical observatories, tracking the movement of stars and planets. Plus, the printing press minted produced the earliest surviving banknotes. The House of Wisdom was truly a cradle of knowledge, a melting pot of cultures, and an oasis of peace. But unfortunately, this golden age didn't last forever. As tensions rose between the Abbasid Caliphate and the Mongol Empire, war became inevitable. And in 1258, the Mongols attacked Baghdad. Horrendous scenes unfolded. Soldiers stormed the city, looted the houses of scholars, and set the House of Wisdom on fire. Historians estimate that up to 2 million books and manuscripts perished in the flames, turning Baghdad into what the Persian poet Ferdowsi described as a graveyard of the intellect. So, is this the real story of the burning of the House of Wisdom? It turns out that no single event destroyed the House of Wisdom. Instead, it was a slow decline that began long before the Mongols arrived. The Abbasid Caliphate had become increasingly unstable and corrupt. Internal conflicts and power struggles drained the treasury and distracted leaders from their duty to support scholarship. Over time, the caliph spent less on translating texts and more on military adventures. Moreover, the Mongols weren't entirely responsible for the destruction of the library. While they certainly caused significant damage, looting and burning many manuscripts, the collection had already suffered greatly. Parts of it were lost to floods, earthquakes, and neglect. Also, it wasn't as big of a library as popularly imagined. Yes, there were extensive collections of scientific and philosophical texts, but the numbers you see thrown around are mostly estimates based on the total number of books owned by the Caliph's library at its peak. So, while the loss of life and knowledge is immeasurable, it's important to approach these claims with a healthy dose of skepticism. Okay, but what happened to the House of Wisdom after the Mongols left? Well, parts of it survived in other libraries around the Islamic world, especially in Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. However, the spirit of the House of Wisdom can still be seen in many places. For example, in the scientific method and academic peer review, which both originated here. And the idea of open access to knowledge, a concept that Wikipedia embodies. Our project aims to make the sum of human knowledge freely available to everyone. And we believe that this is a mission that the scholars of the House of Wisdom would have embraced wholeheartedly. If you want to learn more about the House of Wisdom or the history of science, stay tuned. And if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button. Thanks for watching.